Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, welcome to the All Things Policy podcast. This is Avinash Shet, research analyst from the Takshashila Institution. Today I have with me my colleague Arindam Goswami, who is also a research analyst at Takshashila Institution. Hello Arindam.
Hey, hi Avinash.
In this episode, we are going to talk about India's talent landscape. We are going to talk about the talent gap and need for skilling for our workforce in this ever-changing economic and geopolitical realities. This discussion is based on Arindam's paper from Takshashila Institution's internal conference, which happened in September. And the link to the conference compendium will be available in the podcast description. So we have divided this episode in three sections. First, we are going to go through the changing geoeconomical and geopolitical landscape. In second section, we will be overviewing India's talent prospect. And in the last section, we will go through the solution Arindam has proposed. You can find these timestamps of each section in the podcast description. So let's start from our first section, right? So in this first section, we are going to lay down the realities of ever-changing geoeconomical and geopolitical landscape. So Arindam, you have mentioned many emerging global trends, right? And these are exhaustive. And you have mentioned US-China rivalry, a new Cold War, which is happening between these two. You have also talked about techno-nationalism, which has been happening from quite some time. And finally, you have talked about the climate change, which is one of the emerging front towards this. So I would like to know from you how these changes in geopolitics are changing the industry and hence requirement for the workforce talent with it.
Yeah, so as you rightly mentioned, Avinash, the geopolitical and geoeconomic trends are changing, and the changes are there for all of us to see. Right. As you correctly mentioned, one of the most prominent trends is the intensifying strategic competition between the US and China. This rivalry, it extends beyond the traditional military and economic spheres into the realm of technology also, something that you rightly mentioned, and that's something that I've called the tech Cold War, in my paper. So both of these nations, and in fact, not just these two nations, there are other nations also who are going to vie for, supremacy in such critical areas as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, climate change technologies, 5G, and all of those other technologies which are critical to a nation's economic development and growth, right? So from this, we can segue into something that we can call techno-nationalism, right? So countries are increasingly viewing their technological capabilities as being very much central to national security and economic growth prospects, right? So as we can see in the world today, this has led to a surge in protectionist policies, trade controls, tariffs. The best example is the vast array of controls or checks that the US has put on, imports from China, or blacklisting of Chinese technology companies from, various activities that they can indulge in the US, right? So that's where techno-nationalism has come in. The global semiconductor industry is one of the best examples of that. And the pandemic, for example, made us much more aware of the supply chain related issues in this field. And it made us much more cognizant of the fact that we need to have much more robust global value chains. And in the current scenario of deglobalization, right? There was globalization, which was very beneficial to us, but because of these trade wars, these tech wars, we are sort of maybe entering into something that we can call deglobalization. Not entirely the antithesis of globalization, but you will see much more of de-risking, decoupling, friendshoring, all of those, right, when it comes to supply chain management. So in that scenario, if we could look at this, India as such could look at this as an opportunity, right, to gain a huge section of the pie here. And it is also a security imperative for us, right? We know that, for example, our electronics industry is heavily dependent on imports from China, Chinese components, right? We have, for example, tried the path of import tariffs. We have, as you might be knowing, an inverted tariff structure where the mobile phones, the finished products, are have lesser tariffs than the components, right? Like we have done this to maybe encourage development of the components industry. But the larger point here is that we have not been loath to use these sorts of controls in these geopolitical scenarios that are developing nowadays, right? And to do all of this, it's not just about the investment that you do, right? Obviously, investment or funding is the necessary condition here. Without that, anything else doesn't work. But as we'll talk maybe later in the podcast, just having that investment or having the funding will not help if you don't have the talent ecosystem. So that's where we need to in general develop the talent that is available in India, but also recognizing the current geopolitical imperatives, we need to focus on those areas which will give us most bang for the buck, right? Maybe in a short term, right? Obviously, these are long term battles that we have to fight, but developing a talent ecosystem is very much essential. And that's where, as you mentioned, we have also been entering into alliances and partnerships that are centered around technology, right? So all of the alliances that we have, like for example Quad or AU, KUS, right? All of these sort of are also focused on technology. Yeah.
That's great. So, I mean, now you did talk about the talent, right? So, one of the core question which linger my mind, is how does this talent plays a role in technological development and innovation, right? I mean, intuitively I can understand, but do we have any example by which we can support this claim? Something which has happened or is happening.
Right. So there have been studies that have been done, comparative studies across different nations. One that comes to mind is the one by Professor Sunil Mani, where he has done a comparative analysis of, I think, India, China, South Korea, and some other countries, and Singapore, right? So one of the findings what there is, for example, Singapore paid as much attention to developing the talent ecosystem as it did to the other enabling infrastructure, right? So, and the sort of the learning from there was that without the talent ecosystem, it's going to be well nigh impossible to fill the skill gaps that are necessary to reap the benefits of these industries, of these changing trends. So that's very important, and unless we leverage or build that technical skill, it's going to be difficult, right? So just to elaborate more on the Singapore experience, the country focused on increasing its pool of scientists and engineers, as well as enhance research awareness among small and medium enterprises. It tried to boost enrollments in science and technology related subjects, both at the polytechnic and university levels, right? So that sort of created a robust foundation for innovation, and it also helped in creating a supply of skilled professionals who can then hold this bedrock up. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I mean, Singapore being Singapore, do you think this can be scaled in a country like India? Any views you have onto this?
I think more than the question of whether we will be able to do it is more because we have to do it, and because innovation is the bedrock of development, right? There have been studies that have sort of proven the causal link between innovation and growth, right? And if we have we have the moral imperative to lift millions out of poverty, right? And all of those things that we need to do, which are possible only if we have robust economic growth. And if we were to have that, we have to focus on the current our skill landscape, right? Yeah. So that's very important.
Now, with understanding of this changing talent requirement, as we talked about it earlier, right? Let's unpack India's human capital. Let's try to understand what's happening here, right? And let's understand the talent landscape we have here. So, in your report, you have mentioned that there is a mismatch among these skills of youths, right, and the skills required in the industry. You have put in stats from various reports, showcasing this talent gap. You have stated from India Skills Report of 2024 that only 51% of graduates are employable. Whereas a NASSCOM report says only 12% of IT workforce is skilled in emerging technologies. Now, that is a stark reality of India's workforce, right? And you have touched upon this skill gap in various domains as well. For example, cybersecurity or renewable energy, right? in one of the study from Council of Energy, Environment and Water, that study found that India's renewable energy sector could create around 3.4 million jobs by 2030. But the country currently lacks a workforce with the necessary technical skills to fill in these positions. Only about 40% of required skilled workforce is estimated to be available domestically, right? And there's various other data which shows this stark reality, right? So now, of course, I don't want to bore audience with these stats, but I would like to bring in Arindam to understand why we are at this juncture, right? What went wrong, which led to such skill gap?
So some of the reasons are probably known to all of us. These are not like secrets as such. These are open secrets if you have to think of it in that sense. But one is our focus on basic literacy itself, right? That is the foundation of anything that we try to build on top of that, right? So unless we fix that foundational literacy problem, it's going to be difficult for us to do that, right? So and not just in terms of enrollment ratios and all, but various ACER reports and other reports have shown that the level of learning is not commensurate with the expected levels, right? So that includes math, science, and all those other literacy and skill levels, right? So that's one thing that prevents us from. So we have a sort of a dichotomy where we have these very good higher education institutions like the IITs and IISCs, where which create probably highly skilled people, but at the same time, as you also mentioned, the reports, there are quite a few of them who there's still a lot of gap between what is the requirement in the industry and what the employable skills of the people coming out of the system, right? So that's a dichotomy that we have. We require, there could be many things that can be done. We all know about the higher education system and the onerous regulations that it has to adhere to. These include right from setting the syllabus to the examination patterns to who you can hire, what sort of people you can hire. There are also probably salary caps that are put in. If you want to have probably research being done, how quickly do you get those research grants? Is there a lot of bureaucracy involved in doing that sort of research? So all of that sort of adds up, and I mean, these are all open secrets, so there's nothing really new that I'm talking about here. But yeah, so these are problems, right? From foundational literacy to fixing our higher education system, we have to look at all of that, because we've seen people migrating out of India, right, and doing wonders out there, right? So it's just about that enabling environment that's missing here. Yeah.
So there are a lot of gaps to fill.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of problems which we can see, which we need to fill in, right? And now, this being said, so let's head on to now, as we know what are the problems, or we have discussed or at least mentioned those problems, let's head on to our third section, right? Where I would like to talk about the solutions you have mentioned, right? There is no fun in pointing out the problem, right? And satisfaction comes when we look for solutions. So Arindam, you suggested plethora of solutions, and I would like to discuss few of the disruptive solutions you have put forward, right? You have emphasized that aligning development with global requirement, the need to upskilling in the area of, let's say artificial intelligence, semiconductor, quantum technology, and you have also emphasized on partnership, which includes, let's say defense academia partnership, industry academia partnership. So how do you think these partnership, now as we are talking about academia and, the partnership with defense, partnership with industry, how do this partnership would make a difference in solving this or filling this gap?
Right. So before we delve into that, let's also look at the reasons why there is the skill gap, right? So the factors that we mentioned were sort of the push factors, right? So do we have the necessary school level and college level education systems to create that talent, right? But what happens after the talent, we have that talent, right? Do we have the necessary ecosystem, the forward linkages that help that talent to stay back, right? So if, say, for example, a researcher who comes out of these premier institutes is looking for some top-notch research to be done, does he get those opportunities? Does he or she get those opportunities in these research institutes? Does the research being done in our labs and all materialize into commercialized products, right? So those are sort of the forward linkages that probably anybody who wants to stay back in India would be looking at, right? So the solutions that we need to look at are a combination of both, right? One is to create the foundation, to create the structures, but also to create the incentives that enable the increased spending on research and development, on other such activities, right? Unless you have those pull factors, I'm not sure if people would want to, stay back in India. And even if you want to say attract foreign or say the diaspora, Indian diaspora staying in other countries, will they want to come back, right? It's not just about, it's also the other factors, social and cultural and everything else, right? But also the factors related to research and development. Does that help? Because there's another statistic which probably every one of us knows about private sector R&D being such a minuscule percentage of India's overall R&D spending and all of that, right? So unless that also improves, so my solutions are, structured around those things. And to be clear, like, I mean, obviously there are a lot of steps that have been taken, right? There's the Digital India initiative, which the government has started to, transform India into a digitally empowered society. We have the National Education Policy 2020, which emphasizes on technology in education and aims to also increase digital literacy, critical thinking skills, and all of those things, right? We have the Skill India mission, we have the Niti Aayog's AI initiatives, and there's a plethora of such things that are happening. I'm sure those will also bear fruits, but what my idea was that we need to sort of identify the niche areas or the critical and emerging technologies, identify them, and make very concerted, focused efforts on skilling our population in those areas, because that's what will give us the most bang for buck. And so some of the ideas that I have written about in my paper are sort of aligned towards those. We can go into those, but yeah, I'll pause here.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the important problem you mentioned is, so let me put it, talent as a supply, or let's say talent graduating, right? That's let me call them as supply, and let industry who is going to employ them as demand. So we have seen this gap, right? Between, I mean, even the stats suggest that the quality of students coming out, right? The young professions coming out is something not matching with what industry needs, right? I mean, even though we do, I mean, you did mention about the problem with industry itself, but the major problem right now is, even though we have industries there, but they are finding it difficult to find that talent which can fit in, right? And do you think by any means, when I say any means, could industry come down to a level of universities, and help these? It could be either building curriculums, or it could be either any professionals coming and teaching it in the universities, or other way around, the professors working with industry and understanding where the industry is heading. So do you think this kind of, we can call it collaboration, can help reduce the skilling gap without skilling?
Right. I mean, obviously, we need those sorts of collaborative efforts. We need industry academia collaboration to happen. I mean, there are multiple examples of how this benefits overall, right? So, right now, most of the research in India happens in government research laboratories, right? But do we have the necessary industry linkages out there to see what are those translational applications that come out of this research, right? So that helps, but there are some other reforms also that we need to take into account if we want to create this sort of incentive for industry to collaborate, right? So just look at, for example, NASA and how it contracts out probably 80% of its work to private entities, which could include right from research laboratories to institutes to private sector entities, right? Private industries, right? That creates the incentive for them to collaborate, right? I mean, it's not just about calling people, okay, come and talk to us, right? You have to create those right incentives. You need to first identify what is it that you want to focus on, right? And then create those focused initiatives where industry can come in. Otherwise, with limited resources that any nation always has, if you want to prioritize to some extent, I'm not talking about planned that sort of a thing, but if you want to give maybe a directional nudge, then that sort of focus is required. And yes, industry would then find it much more easier to come in and do these collaborations. And as you mentioned, you talked about something like, so one of the ideas that I had was like mandatory sabbaticals to industry professionals to probably go and do research, or that sort of lateral sort of work that maybe people from industry can do. So that helps the research institutes or the higher education institutes also to develop that bridge between what is being taught and what is required in the industry, and it gives us a better skilled population. So yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So now, before we, get to your disruptive solutions, one of the very simple solution which you mentioned was leveraging our existing strengths, right? And it's very interesting. So can you please, shed some light on that? How we can leverage it to, build a strength, upskill. So how is going to help
Right.
in this whole landscape?
So the general idea is that if we want, there'll be hundreds of things that we would probably want to do in terms of talent development. But given the resources that we at our stage of development have, we have to prioritize, right? And in that sense, the general idea of leveraging your existing strengths will always help, right? And this has to be a dynamic thing. So for example, today something might be an existing strength, but tomorrow it might change. So this has to be always calibrated. So what is probably what are those strengths that we have right now? Our world-renowned IT services industry is probably something that we can build on. We have a very robust startup ecosystem here, software startup ecosystems, industries that are working in probably AI applications, probably design, right? In the semiconductor value chain, we have good sort of skill in the EDA phase, right? The design phase, right? So those are our skills that we have probably, right? And my idea is, if you want the biggest return on your investment in maybe a short period of time, then we need to focus on these areas which are our strengths, and then go all in on that, right? And use all sorts of mechanisms that can help us get a leg up, right? Otherwise, playing catch up will not always work, right? I mean, say for example, the semiconductor industry, in the probably the fabrication and those sorts of stages in the supply chain, we have a lot of ground to catch up, right? And it will not be an easy thing, irrespective of the investments that we do, right? There are other geopolitical aspects also, but something that is our strength, why don't we leverage that, is what I think we can do.
I mean,
We have strengths in sort of frugal innovation also, right? We have strengths, for example, localized apps, right? So that sort of a framework where we look at our strengths can probably help.
yeah, I mean, I can also include space, medicine,
Yeah,
and
yeah. The pharmaceutical industry,
correct.
probably.
Yeah.
So that's a funny stat, not a funny stat, but good enough stat that amongst the industry verticals, if we look at them in terms of the amount of R&D that they do, pharmaceutical industry probably ranks higher than even a
Yes.
software industry.
Yes, yes,
If we leave aside, some
Correct.
other industries. Yeah. So pharmaceutical industry, by global standards, it is still less, but compared to other industry verticals in India, pharmaceutical industry is probably our
Yeah.
strength. Yeah.
So let's dive on to your first disruptive solution. So now that's something called the LEAP initiative, right? And it's very interesting that it is driven by private sector. The National Skill Development Program driven by private sector. Now this program is very unique. Providing private sector to take on the baton. It's unique, and I would like to know more about it. What are you suggesting, and how did you come?
Right. So the reason for involving the private sector is, firstly, we need to get rid of the distrust that we have of the private sector, right? And in India, we sort of look towards the government to solve everything, right? But with the limited resources that the governments have, and the other problems of bureaucratic red tape and corruption, all of those things, it's always not going to be fruitful to look towards the government, right? And that's where I've also talked of like innovative financial mechanisms that we need to look at, right? So if you were to look at the Quantum Leap initiative, I've just named it that way, we can call it anything, but what that involves is probably we need to establish 10 or maybe X number of, say 10 number of privately owned autonomous skill cities, right, across India, each of which will focus on a critical technology, critical domain, say AI, quantum computing. And these skill cities will focus only on skill development and the peripherals that are required to do that, right? These will be self-contained ecosystems with education facilities, R&D centers, startup incubators, and industry partnerships, right? Now, to do this, obviously 10 cities is not going to be something that just government can just conjure up the money to do that, right? So we'll require innovative financial mechanisms, which could probably include things like public, private, and VC funds, right? And these VC funds will have the attached profit incentives, maybe equity shares in whatever IP that gets developed. So trading in secure IP, we need to develop probably a market in that, because otherwise it becomes difficult to leverage your investment in an IP, right? So that is one thing. If you want to develop talent, then we need to look at things like strategic skill bonds, right? So these bonds will allow investors to finance students' education in critical fields, and what would be the repayment mechanism? It would be tied to the student's income, but activated only when they secure jobs in India, right? So it sort of funds the education, but also incentivizes the linkage to be longer, right? And it not just in the moment or just based on quick profits, right? It sort of ties the investment with the outcome of achieving talent development, right? We would require something like a corporate talent futures market. So companies can invest in promising talent, fund their education, but the future commitments to work, or the future commitment to a share of their future earnings, right? So those sorts of mechanisms where we bring in the market, which I guess with the changing times has now acquired good connotation. Otherwise, markets and all of that have sometimes a bad connotation in India, right? So yeah, the other innovative mechanism could be like advanced market commitments, right? So if you want to develop talent and then see it do some good work, then the industry, for example, would require some sort of pull funding, right? Something that we call pull funding, that is advanced commitments to buy their IP or the product that comes out of that research work, irrespective of what is the time that is taken to do it, right? So that sort of advanced market commitments, which have been used in the past for various things, right? Even the COVID-19 vaccines were developed by something of that sort, right? So if you want to give a push to innovation and the talent development that is required for that, then these sorts of innovative mechanisms are required. Now, coming back to the Quantum Leap initiative, right? So in these mega skill cities, it can't be the old way of teaching, right? It can't be the old way of learning, or old way of having education. We need, say for example, and I'm just throwing out things, but these can be we need to look at long short way of doing things also, right? Say AI powered personalized learning, or virtual reality immersive learning, right? So those sorts of things. Skill verification, right? So that is also an important thing. So if you want to make sure that the skill that is developed in these cities is usable across different locations, not just in India but abroad also, then we need a way to make sure that this skill is verified and recognized elsewhere also. So probably the traditional methods may not help. So if something like a blockchain based skill verification mechanism. So these are sort of new things that we need to think of, which will probably go into this Quantum Leap initiative. The government's role should ideally be just restricted to an enabling role, right? You create, for example, a regulatory sandbox. You can create a special economic zone for status for such skill cities, and that should have minimal regulations, tax incentives, that sort of thing. Fast track visas, right? Something that we keep talking about. It's not just about, so in India, even researchers from abroad find it difficult to get research visas and those sorts of things. So if we can make that process a lot less cumbersome, that would probably help. Yeah. So that's sort of and the impact could be high, right? We could create probably, we should aim for higher, maybe 1 million or so, something of that sort, high skilled professionals in each of these strategic sectors, and that could then snowball into a skill development industry as such, right? Right now, because we are not looking at the skill development industry as an industry as such, we are looking at it as an enabling factor. Probably that's why the skill development industry is not developing along the lines that we want it. EdTech is developing, but how do we make sure that it aligns with our geopolitical interests is maybe the reason behind this idea as such. Yeah.
Correct. I mean, even the idea you mentioned, each city being a regulatory sandbox could be one of the interesting way to say it, right? I mean, you can try out different things and see what works, what skilling, what education method works to skill these people, right? To skill our youth.
Yeah, and there have been some initiatives like that abroad also, right? So, for example, China has this Greater Bay Area initiative, right, where it is trying to develop the Greater Bay Area as a hub for innovation and technology, right? So, there have been some examples which should try to learn from, and then use it to build these sort of futuristic niche product, niche area focused strategies.
That's nice. I mean, I think you covered almost everything which I wanted to ask you now. But one of the very interesting mention, which you have, wrote in your report is reverse brain drain, right? I mean, I don't know if you can call it brain gain or so, but getting, highly talented NRIs who are based out of, who are not based in India and, are doing a remarkable research, remarkable job outside, getting them back and working in here. So I mean, that's interesting. I mean, how do you think, what kind of ecosystem, what kind of, again, ecosystem we can build so that they would be attracted to come back?
Right. So, as you correctly mentioned, we need to stop looking at, brain gain and brain drain sort of things. Like, so talent moving fluidly across borders is a very good thing. In fact, in the compendium that my paper is a part of, there are some other papers which have talked about the benefit of immigrant talent, right, and how that has led to not just growth in research and development, but also the consequent improvement in growth and economic development, right? So there is always a benefit to having talent intermingle with each other, right? So in that sense, not just to retain or attract back Indians, right? We require a talent as robust skill ecosystem to in general attract talent. It could be from any part of the world, right? Why don't we aim to be the USA of the world, right, when it comes to attracting talent, right? We have our own people, but it's erroneous to think that if people of other nations come to India, it would probably be disadvantageous to us, right? So in that sense, attracting talent is one of the most important things, and some things that we talked about give pointers to what can be done, right? Research ecosystem, if it can be gotten out of the bureaucratic mess that generally it is in, right? So one of my pet ideas, obviously a pet idea, I mean, people in general have that, right, but is to not have our research ecosystems dominated so much by government laboratories, right? Because the incentives there are different, right? It sort of becomes a matter of the perverse incentives and the moral hazards that come in with that, right? So instead of that, why not involve the private sector in all of this research and in a focused way, right? There are various mechanisms to consider here, like even the DARPA model, right? If we can sort of use that to focus on just few niche areas of talent development, right? And obviously it's focused on research, but then you also use that to probably develop the talent, right? So that sort of focused strategy will probably help. And as we just talked about the higher education system, right? That is in serious need of development. We, so for example, don't allow for profit education institutes, right? So that's maybe a low hanging fruit. We are worried about maybe the consequent price rise in the fees and all of that, but those are things that you can probably look at. But to keep the education sector itself tied up in so many onerous regulations, that doesn't help to attract talent. Yeah.
I understand that from the inception of, or from the independence of India, right? So the government has always kept education as a social good, right? And that's where we can see how closely it keep it as such, right? So now, do you think this for-profit model would bring the quality of education what we are craving into the education ecosystem here? I mean, it could be both in terms of, so what do you think, that will this, or if yes, in what ways the quality of education can be increased, right? I mean, some thoughts onto it. I mean, you have already mentioned it, but yeah.
So, I mean, there have been already studies done, some famously by Karthik Muralidharan and others, in terms of how we can bring in more private sector oriented initiatives to improve foundational literacy, right? So, education vouchers and those sorts of things which help, which give the freedom to parents to decide where their children should be educated, and that sort of creates a competition between private sector and public sector also. So, as he has also mentioned, right? So, in public sector, you get less out of the education system per unit amount of money spent than in the private sector, right? Because the incentives there
Yes,
align
yes.
differently, right? So that sort of makes a case for having more for profit sort of institutes also, right? Profit need not always be a bad word. So we have sort of created these noble professions, right? Something that Anupam Manur had talked in one of the ATP episodes also, right? So do we really need to look at things as like those sorts of fields where profit is not good, right? So that's maybe a mindset change that we need to get in. And the reason, see, profit motive creates the incentives for more investments, right? Otherwise, now if you see, the education sector is being captured by vested interests who know how to game the system, right? So, and who are these people? It's going to be people in power who probably have the wherewithal to game the system, right? So is it really helping the quality of education, right? We need to look at that, and that's where probably the for-profit model of education is something that we need to seriously look at. It
Yeah,
helps in creating those incentives for these institutions to go looking out for maybe an industry linkage or
correct,
industry
correct,
collaboration,
correct,
right?
correct.
Otherwise, now what creates that incentive? If your research is not going to have forward linkage into commercialization of the into a product, does it really help? If industry is not sure about who retains the IP out of that collaboration that happens. If all of these things are not well thought out, then it becomes difficult for us to achieve any sort of worthwhile growth in the talent ecosystem.
So you did mention about the voucher, right? A voucher to fund every youth to upskill themselves, right? Now, this could be something which could help students to manage their fees, reducing the financial burden, and so and especially for the underprivileged students, right?
Right.
So tell us more about it. I mean, how do you see this working or making an impact, and in what ways this can be implemented?
Right. So the idea behind a universal national skill voucher program is to, at the base tax, it's about every citizen receiving some amount of money as a learning voucher when he maybe at the age of 18 or something, right? So that he can use that for either lifelong learning or for learning over a period of time, right? And currently, since we need to focus on critical and emerging technologies, probably we can restrict it to only those sectors, right? Otherwise, limited resources, you can't focus on everything, right? So probably condition the availability of this money on the fact that they have to use it for learning in those critical areas, right? It also then gives the freedom or the backing to the youth of our country to engage in further skill development, right? Money, for example, is quite often one of the restrictions that anybody would face when trying to upskill themselves, right? So we try to minimize that, and it sort of incentivizes skill development in terms of you could structure it differently. It could either be a one-time payment or a recurring payment, or it could be something like a learning bonus, right? Or you skill yourself in a particular field and you get a learning bonus, or you, for example, partner with the employers to see that that money is provided to the employee if he upskills himself in certain skills. But and at the same time, it's important to ensure that people are not able to game this incentive also, right? So for that, you require proper accreditation and those sorts of mechanisms and skill verification mechanisms that we talked about, right? But yeah, this could help provide at least the basic necessary condition for people to start upskilling themselves. So that's the idea behind this universal national skill voucher program. Obviously, considering that India has a huge young population, we need to look at the economics of it all, right? How do we fund it? It cannot obviously be funded just by the government. It needs some private sector initiatives, private sector entities also to come in, and that's where maybe the innovative financial mechanisms that we talked about can be used. You could have sort of a pooled fund, a sovereign talent fund that I mentioned in my paper also, right? Which could be funded not just by the sovereign, that is the government, but also maybe VC funds. And then out of that, we could probably disburse some of this money, but ensure that it is also tied to a proper outcome along the lines that we want in the fields that we want. Yeah.
Correct, correct. Yeah, I mean, if regulated and implemented properly, then it could change the way upskilling happens, right? So, yeah, it was great to have a discussion with you, Arindam, and thank you for your insights on skilling landscape in this dynamic geoeconomic and geopolitical realities, right? So, I hope we can advocate these solutions to skill our workforce to climb up the value chain of employability. Thank you, Arindam.
Thank you. And just to throw out some stats which probably could help shift the Overton window towards India focusing more on talent development, right? Or even the for-profit education sector. So why is the for-profit education sector important? Because there have been studies which have shown that a liberalized for-profit education sector could become a significant employer and contributor to GDP, right? In the US, for instance, the education sector contributed 5.9% of the GDP in, I guess, 2023. So in India, with its large, youth population, we could have maybe even higher potential in this, right? And that's what we want to aim for. So it was nice talking to you, Avinash, and a very interesting topic which we can delve.
Yeah, we can have multiple podcasts on each of the solution you have mentioned, though. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.